So good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for my first in a series of webinars where I'll be talking about the Taubman approach and some ideas from Alexander technique and how they all come together and correlate to make everything work well. I do want to just kind of mention a couple things at the beginning. I am recording this session, so if you're interested in receiving the recording afterwards, just let me know and I will send you either a Dropbox or Drive link that will allow you to access the recording. Also, for those of you who do not know her already, we have Angela Senex here, and she is going to be kind of moderating the chat. So if questions arise while I'm speaking, go ahead and type it up and send it in the chat, and I'll take a break every couple as I kind of go through certain points and see if we have any questions and do my best to answer them as well as I can. Let's see. And I think that that's all the business stuff. So just a little bit of background about myself. I am, of course, Seth Thomas, and I have been teaching piano privately for 13 years now. I have a Master of Music degree in piano performance. I was very fortunate throughout all of my college years to study with Taubman-trained teachers, Dr. Brian Allison, Vicki Conway, Dr. Angelin Chang, and, of course, my biggest inspiration, Sheila Page. A little bit about Taubman technique and why it's called the Taubman technique. Dorothy Taubman was a pianist and a teacher in the 20th century, and she really had some very innovative ideas that she came upon as she encountered these young pianists who had brilliant careers ahead of them but seemed to be cut down by injuries and fatigue and just all these things that were preventing them from seeing their full potential. So she did a lot of experimenting with more natural uses of the arm and of the hand and came up with some really interesting ideas that we'll continue to talk about. Now, most of my training, as I mentioned a moment ago, has kind of been handed down through one of Dorothy's proteges, Sheila Page. And so what Sheila did is really took the Taubman approach, which deals mostly with the forearm, and Sheila took that and said, okay, well, the forearm's connected to an upper arm, the upper arm's connected to a torso, the torso's connected to the body, and this body has a mind and a soul and a spirit that all need nurturing and all need taking care of in order for us to function at our highest capacity. And so I can't start any sort of session about the work of these two women without thanking them profusely from the bottom of my heart, because without them, I would not be where I am today. I would not be playing the piano. I would not be teaching piano. I would have probably crashed and burned, physically speaking, in my first semester of college. So I'm very, very grateful to both of them. Just checking that waiting room. All right. One person to whom both these women attribute a lot of some foundational principles, let's call them, is a man named Otto Ortmann, who was a pianist and teacher at Peabody in the 20th century. He wrote a very revolutionary book, especially for the time, called The Physiological Mechanics of Piano Technique. Now, in this book, he presented a lot of different ideas, some good ideas and some, let's say, strange ideas. And some of them definitely don't work. But there are three ideas that we can take away from this book that are really great and really serve as a good jumping off point. The first idea is kind of one of those ones that makes you say duh when you hear it, but it is that the least amount of effort produces the maximum result. Now, what is meant by that is that obviously not doing nothing, because that would be the least amount of effort, but you want to use the least possible amount of effort that you can put towards something while still putting in the work that is necessary to achieve the best result from something. Our problem tends not to be our underuse, but it tends to be overuse. So when we stumble upon a tool, we tend to use it too much, or we tend to use too much of it. which are two different things. His second principle is that all repetitive motions, which is all that playing the piano is repetitive motions, all repetitive motions should happen in the mid-range of motion. In other words, as humans, and I'm going to stand up for a moment, and if you wish to stand up or experience any of these things at home, I invite you to do so. As humans, we have extreme ranges of motion, which I'm not going to go to my full extreme here because I don't want to lift my shirt up and flash y'all. And we have mid-ranges of motion. And we see that at the piano, extreme and mid. All right? And then his third principle is that we want to use motions that avoid what he called a duomuscular pull, or in the medical field, they call a muscular co-contraction. What that is when you have two opposing sets of muscles working at the same time, they are working antagonistically. In other words, they're working against one another. So if I drop one finger and lift all my other fingers, I have one finger is flexed and all my other fingers are extended. I have two sets of muscles working against each other simultaneously, which can produce a lot of inefficiency and if overdone, can produce injury, which we'd like to avoid. So, using those as a kind of diving in point, I'd like to start talking about some anatomical units which are useful to pianists. The first one that I'd like to speak about is the arm. All right? What exactly is the arm? Where does it go from? Where does it come from? Where does it go? And I'm going to start at the tip of the arm, all right, which I believe to be the tips of the fingers. If you were to order, which I actually did order, a skeleton arm from a medical supply company, and it did not arrive in time. It was delayed in shipping, and so it is not here to be with us today, which is regrettable because I had hoped to do some demonstrating with it. But if you do order one, a skeletal mechanism of the arm, you will receive from the fingers all the way back to the, you'll have the clavicle included and the scapula, all right? And that means, according to medicine at least, that our arms include those two parts. But we're not going to start with those two parts. We'll talk about them later. So starting by talking about the fingers, the hands, and a little bit of the wrist. One thing that seems to crop up at an increasing rate, at least I seem to notice it at an increasing rate in a lot of our forums online today, is this idea that there are no muscles in the fingers. And I'm not going to dwell on that a whole lot. I'm just going to reiterate that there are no muscles in the fingers. You can pop open any anatomy book that has been written accurately within the last probably 50 years or so and see that to be true. And so if there are no muscles in the fingers, there's really not a whole lot of point doing exercises or buying little finger weights to strengthen the fingers because there are no muscles in the fingers to strengthen. That being said, that's oftentimes not what a lot of people mean by finger strength, and so, like I say, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time dwelling on that. What I will say is, when you have your students just hold their hands by their side and bring them up, they can see a nice natural shape to the hand, which includes a couple features. The first it includes is a nice natural curve to the fingers. All right? The other thing it includes is a natural tilt. It's different degrees depending on the hand, but a nice natural tilt to the hands towards the pinky side of the hand. All right? Those are two things that can be noticed immediately. When I'm talking to my students, I avoid using words like curl or even curve, although the fingers are naturally curved. When I'm speaking of how their fingers should look on the keys, I like to use the words rounded and supported, all right? And we'll talk about what rounded and supported means in a bit. The next thing that I'd like to talk about is what controls the fingers, all right? We have three sets of muscles or tendons that can be said to control the actions of the fingers, all right? We have the long flexors, we have the short flexors, and we have the abductor and adductor muscles. And I'm sorry, I just left out. They're technically, well, three sets of muscles, and maybe I said that the right thing. So we have the flexors and extensors, long and short, and then we have the abductors and the adductors, all right? So we'll start by talking about the long flexors, all right? The long flexors are the flexors that run from this joint right here all the way up the arm to the elbow. So that when I do a motion like this or this, I'm engaging my long extensors and my long flexors. Now, this is something you might want to try at home. A lot of method books teach students to hold their hands as though they're holding a ball or a bubble softly, all right? Even if you don't grip in this position, you've engaged your long flexors. And if you try wiggling your fingers, there's really just not a lot of agility or speed, all right? And I want you to keep that in mind. Another problem with the long flexors and extensors is that because they go all the way back to the elbow, they go through the carpal tunnel. And I'd like to spend just a couple minutes talking about the carpal tunnel, what it is and what the syndrome is and why the syndrome sometimes develops. So the carpal tunnel is simply just this sheath, a ligament goes across the wrist like so, and inside of this passage in the wrist, there are tendons that control the hand, nerves, and the arteries and veins that supply the blood flow to the hand. And so what happens oftentimes with this is that we have students who will oftentimes play like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. This last one is not as common, all right? We call that radial deviation, all right? This is probably one of the most common, along with collapsed wrist or raised wrists, all right? There are a couple problems with that. One of which is that if you are taking all those tendons and working them around this curve, it's something like taking a rope and finding a edge, even something like this would do, and just rubbing it continuously over that edge, over and over and over. And eventually what starts to happen to that rope is it starts to fray. Well, that happens in your tendons. They start to get irritated working around this curve, or this curve, or this curve, or this curve. And when the body gets irritated, it swells. And you've got this infinitely small space, or sorry, not infinitely, finitely small space in the wrist. And as your tendons start to swell, they start to expand in there. They start to push bones apart in the wrist, which is why one of the symptoms of carpal tunnel syndrome is popping wrists. Another symptom is shooting pains. That's because those tendons start to press, or the bones even sometimes start to press on nerves. And oftentimes cold hands or numbness, which the numbness comes from the nerves as well. The cold hands comes from the cutoff of the circulation of those veins and arteries that feed the hand. So it's very unfortunate that any of those symptoms should arise. However, especially when it comes to the sharp shooting pains or the numbness in the hand, you have to be careful. The other symptoms, the coldness, I can see being a problem with carpal tunnel. I can also see the popping of the wrist being a problem with carpal tunnel, but the shooting pains and the numbness could be nerve problems in one of 4 places. One of which is the carpal tunnel. The other is the elbow. There's a bunch of nerves that sits there at the elbow. If you were, probably none of you were as silly a child as I was, I always used to go around smashing my elbow on tables and such because you'd get that funny tingling sensation in your arms. And, you know, me being me, I thought, well, that's why it's called the funny bone. I think later I learned in life that it's called the funny bone because it's the humerus. But anyways, you'd get that tingling sensation. So it could be something that you've done there, some nerve damage that you've done there. There's also an outlet here called the thoracic outlet, all right, by the sternoclavicular joint where the clavicle meets the top of the sternum. There could be a nerve damage there from a collapsed shoulder or again, anything else if you've been in a sort of accident. And then at the base of the skull and the top of the neck, there is the atlanto-occipital joint, which is where there is a bundle of nerves, which, again, if you've sat like this, or like this, or again, had some sort of an accident, there can be some nerve damage there that causes trouble. So one thing I meant to say at the beginning of this, and I'll say it now because now is as good a time as any, I'm not a doctor, in case you didn't know that. I'm a piano teacher. I cannot diagnose any medical disease. I can speak from experience and experience that has been shared with me from others. So if you're experiencing problems in these areas, please go get them checked out. I'm not telling you not to. But when you know, if you go and get something like that checked out, make sure that you have your doctor check out your elbow, check out your thoracic outlet, and check out your AO joint as well, your atlanto-occipital joint. Blah, that's a mouthful. So that's something to consider when it comes to the carpal tunnel. Another problem with misalignment, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, is when you're using arm weight and your arm is like this, or like this, or like this, or like this. It's really quite impossible, and we'll talk some more about this, it's quite impossible to put the weight of the arm behind each finger, all right? And that's all I'll say about that for right now. We'll talk about that in a moment. I do want to talk about carpal tunnel surgery for just a moment. I'm not going to come out as being for or against it. That's a personal decision. There can be any number of reasons why someone would choose to go and have that, and I'm not going to tell you not to. What I will caution you with is that if you have it, you still need to retrain. You still need to rethink your usage, because if you continue to misuse yourself, you're going to probably start to develop the same injuries again, because your tendons and such are going to start being irritated and swelling up again. So that's just a little caution, not something that's for or against necessarily. The next bit I'd like to talk about is the short flexors and extensors, and they're what allow us to do this right here. Now remember, we talked about the long flexors and extensors, which is this right here. All right, this right here. Try those both back to back. Long flexors and extensors like so, short flexors and extensors like so. Hopefully you can feel that this is a lot more free. It's a lot less restrictive, all right? So that is what we would call the mid-range of motion. Remember, we talked about repetitive motion happening in the mid-range of motion. So if this is the mid-range of motion for the fingers, then this is what our fingers are allowed, quote unquote, to do. The other set of muscles in the fingers that I'll talk about is the abductors and the adductors, and that's what allows for this motion in the fingers. Now this is a very slow motion. This is the motion that you need to play large intervals. All right? It's a very slow motion, so any interval that you play at your extreme range needs to be approached very slowly and very carefully. You don't want to pull them out very quickly, because they aren't speed muscles, all right? Again, especially at that extreme range. Let's see. So, having talked about that, having spoken of our long flexors versus our short flexors, and assuming we're on the same page to this point, if this is all we're allowed to do with our fingers, then what function do the fingers play, and what other resources do we have to help us? Because this is not going to do a whole lot for us at the piano. Certainly not as much as this, if we're speaking merely fingers. At this point, before I go on to that next bit, I want to ask if we have any questions, Angela.
Hi, I don't see any yet in the chat, but I had one actually. Can I ask mine, and then we'll see if anyone else has one to add? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I think Joellen had one too. Go ahead, Joellen.
Yeah, if you don't mind just saying it. Short flexors and long flexors, I couldn't tell the difference with the hand
that was
motion.
mine too.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's see. Let me show you just a little bit. Let me change my camera angle here real quick and see if a little bit closer gives you a better view of that. Okay, so, oops. All right, so long flexors is this pushing down like so. Short flexors would be just this, all right? So this is really pulling down, almost feeling like you're pulling down here from the nail joint. Short flexors feels almost more like you're moving from here. You are still moving from the tip of the finger, at least to my perception you are, all right? But it's not pushing all the way down. So a lot of us, or at least I was taught this sort of playing as opposed to something like this. So it's not quite as involved here at the knuckle. It doesn't go dig down quite as deep. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I see the difference between long and flex. Can you demonstrate what you just did on the piano, the two different ways you would be taught?
So this would be long flexors engaged.
Because it's a big knuckle.
Now here's the thing. When I use my short flexors, you have to take what I'm about to do with a grain of salt because I'm not just using my short flexors, I'm using them to activate other motions. But this would be me using my short flexors. Whoops.
Okay.
One thing that you probably can notice is that when it's just my long flexors, it's a lot more what some people might call finger independence, or in Taubman we call it isolation. So it's kind of the fingers functioning on their own, which doesn't really work out so great when you get to 4 and 5. Whereas when I'm playing with my short flexors, they all kind of become engaged.
Okay.
Now, as I say that, I'm activating those short flexors, or I'm activating other motions by using those short flexors. And we won't get into a huge discussion of that today, but we will kind of talk about that in the next segment. Any other questions?
No, that's it for me. That clears it.
That was my same question, so thanks, Joellen. I don't see any more in the chat either.
Okay, very good. All right. So I will, let's see, I'll switch back to facing you all. All right. So the next thing then that I'd like to talk about, so we've kind of dealt with the fingers, the hands, the wrists, and what goes through the wrist at least. I'd like to talk about the forearm and the upper arm. And when I say the upper arm, I'm just really talking about the humerus bone, all right? So if our fingers are restricted to this short flexor motion, and all these fingers are kind of moving together, and by itself, as I just told you, that short flexor motion doesn't really accomplish anything at the piano, okay? By itself, that's the key word there, or the key phrase there, all right? We see a lot of discussion in our groups also, and in various places, about arm weight. And it's one of those topics that I think you could get 5 people in the room talking about arm weight, and each one of them would probably have a different idea in mind, okay? Taubman teaches forearm weight, and I have to be careful here because I'm not entirely, it's been a while since I've listened to Sheila lecture or had a lesson with her. I'm not entirely sure where she stands on this. So I'm not sure if this is an innovation of mine, a thought of mine, or something that I've taken from her. I'll give her credit. I don't want to give her credit and have her think that I'm misrepresenting what she says. And I don't want to not give her credit and have her think that I'm stealing from what she says. So just to be safe, it's possible that it's something that Sheila said. We'll say that. But to me, forearm weight doesn't really do a lot, okay? It can make a key go down. If I just drop my forearm into the key by itself, that's great. But it's really not, to me, the heavy part of the arm. The heavy part of the arm is up here. It's the upper arm that's the heavy part of the arm, okay? Now, when I say that weight comes from the upper arm, I'm not saying that we play down from the shoulder or anything like that. That's, you'll see in a bit that goes against pretty much everything that I believe. But because of the anatomy of the arm, it's very possible that for each note to receive arm weight, it needs to have this drop into it, all right? Now, what arm weight is not is a dead weight dropping into the keys. Now, a dead weight dropping coming from somebody who's come from a very isolated technique, a very long flexor-oriented technique, a dead weight dropping into, especially just into the lap, as I'm doing right now, can be very useful because it teaches them just to let go of their arm. So that can be a useful exercise, but it's not a final product, okay? So the humerus, the upper arm bone, there's only one bone in the upper arm, is the weight of the arm. When I'm talking about arm weight, that's what I'm talking about. Now, when we go down into the forearm, we have two bones. On our thumb side, we have the radius, and on our pinky side, we have the ulna. Now, they both have unique functions. The radius, and again, this is where I wish I had my skeleton arm this time around. Hopefully next month when I talk about rotation, I'll have it. But what the radius does is it turns over the ulna, so it allows for this motion right here. All right. Now the ulna is really going to be our focal point. All right, because the ulna, what it does is it connects into the humerus. Now, I want you to understand when I say what I'm about to say, I'm not talking about muscles, tissues, skin, fat, anything. I'm talking strictly bone to bone. This is the ulna hooking into the humerus at the elbow is the only place where the forearm connects to the upper arm. Again, that's speaking skeletally, not musculature, not anything else, just skeletally, all right? Why is that important? Because there's this connection here, bone to bone, that allows the ulna to bear down that weight of the upper arm. And I think that's where the Taubman idea of forearm weight comes. But I think that the forearm being connected to the upper arm allows for that motion there, because the ulna lifts, and as you can see, that upper arm comes forward a little bit. Now, of course, this is not your most efficient way of picking up and dropping, but that allows for that to happen. All right? Now, what the ulna cannot do is rotate over the radius. So the radius can rotate over the ulna, which allows for this. All right? What the ulna cannot do is rotate over the radius. It does not turn over the radius. So when you want to rotate over the radius, you actually have to swing back all the way to the shoulder. And that's a place where you can definitely see the involvement of the upper arm, okay? So you have to watch your students. Sometimes there's students that have kind of a loose tissue connection in their arm, and so they can kind of trick you into thinking that they're rotating by doing this. All right, I can't really do it because I don't have a loose tissue connection, but you'll notice that their upper arm doesn't really swing out much. And so that's a very tight feeling. Even with loose tissues, that's a very tight sort of feeling. So you want to really make sure that they have that freedom at the elbow and the freedom in the shoulder to do that, and that will enable them to rotate. So if we combine this idea of short flexors and arm weight, then we say, okay, so I'm allowed to use my fingers in kind of this small range, and I'm allowed to use my arm. Now, what is my arm capable of doing? Well, we break it down in Taubman technique. We break it down to 4 basic motions, one of which I've kind of talked about, and that's rotation, all right? Another is in and out movements, or forward and back, all right? When I say in and out, I mean in towards the keys and out towards the body. So that can be a little bit of confusing language, so forward and back works, all right? There's up and down motion, all right? And there is lateral motion, left and right, all right? And Taubman technique, and I'm 100% with them on this, teaches that between every two notes, some combination of all four of those motions needs to happen. So if I'm just simply going from C to D, I'm not just going to rotate. I'm going to come out. I'm going to come up a little bit because I'm going to a taller finger. And I'm also moving to the right, slightly. All right? So there's a rotation. There was an out motion. It could have been an in motion. There was an up motion. It could have been a down motion. And there was a right motion. It could have been a left motion. All right? So there's always a rotation. There's always an in or out. There's always an up or down. And there's always a left or right between every two notes. That's a lot to swallow. That's a lot to think about. That's a lot to take in. But then again, I think the material covered today is probably some of the most, it's a lot of information. Hopefully a lot of it is making sense and ringing a bell for you in some regards, or ringing true to maybe experiences that you've had. But yeah, that's you're kind of getting an information dump today. All right. Next, I'd like to talk about the shoulder, the scapula, and the clavicle. All right. The shoulder is a ball and socket joint. So I'm going to stand up so I don't knock my overhead camera over. It's one of those motions that allows for you to have this. All right. Now we don't need to use a whole lot of that at the piano, thankfully, but it does have to be, our shoulders do have to be free in order for us to be able to rotate over our radius. All right. The scapula is your shoulder blade. All right. And the clavicle extends inward, connects at the shoulder, and extends inward and connects to the torso at the sternum. So that's what we call the sternoclavicular joint. All right. Now, what's important about especially acknowledging the clavicle as part of the arm, is that it allows for your arms to move in front of you. If you're thinking of the shoulder as the end of the arm, then when we bring our arms in front of us, we tend to do this. Now, it's a little hard to see the difference, and again, I wish I had my skeleton arm, but it's a little hard to see it, but if you try it, you might feel it. If you pull in at your shoulder, there's a tightness that kind of comes into the upper arm here, all right? Now, we'll talk about why we don't want a tightness in the upper arm. Well, may as well talk about it now, because we've already discussed that the upper arm is where your weight comes from. Now, if you're dropping your arm weight, and your upper arm is where your arm weight is, and you've got this tightness in here, that's going to be then held up into the air so that your upper arm can't truly drop. Another place that we tend to pull in from is the elbow, like this, all right? This creates a couple problems. It creates the problem of a collapsed elbow, all right, which can cause nerve damage at the elbow. And it also creates tightness in the upper arm, which again restricts that motion of dropping that arm weight. I also feel a restriction in my forearm as well. But if I think at the clavicle, if I think to come in all the way, to my clavicle, then I don't feel this tightness in here. I don't feel this restriction in here. I'm able to move my arm up and down quite freely, all right? All right, and there's not a crunch in at the shoulder. It just swings in like so. And that's useful because a lot of students, especially in beginning repertoire, find themselves playing in front of themselves, rather. All right. Now, there's a couple other elements that go into play to moving the arms in front of the body. We won't go into that just yet. This is something that I'd like for you to try. This next thing. So we talked about bringing the arm in front of the body. Next, you want to be really careful here at the shoulder. All right. To be careful to avoid raising your arms at the shoulder like this. All right. If you try this at home, you might want to stand up and just allow your arms just to swing freely. All right. Now, I want you to raise your shoulders. I don't want you to, don't shrug, not a huge raise, just just a slight raise, just a little bit. And try swinging your arms. And again, this is something you're going to want to feel. You might not see it as much, but you can probably feel it. And I feel a tremendous amount of restriction. And it also, by the way, when I raise my shoulders, I not only feel restriction in my arms, I feel a restriction in my breathing mechanism, okay? It makes it harder to breathe. Breathing is kind of essential to everything that we do, because if we don't breathe, we die, all right? So then I let my arm go, and I've got this freedom again, all right? Now I'm going to take, and I'm going to roll my shoulders forward, and again, I'm not going to do a huge, exaggerated thing. I'm just going to roll them forward a bit. And again, I feel this restriction here at my shoulders, all right, in my arms because of my shoulders. So I'm going to let them go back, and now I'm swinging freely again. And now this one is not as common, but it happens sometimes, especially if the mentality is sit up straight, throwing the shoulders back like that. And again, you get this restriction, especially on the back swing. Just not a whole lot. And it creates a tension, again, in the breathing mechanism and a tension in the upper back. It's really just not desirable if you can just keep a free swing, okay? So let's see, that takes us from the wrist all the way up to the top of the arm. So that was our kind of our next anatomical unit. So are there any questions to this point?
Nothing in the chat yet.
Nothing in the chat? And nothing from anybody? Okay, cool. All right, so then this brings, you may be thinking, okay, what does all this information have to do with the piano and playing the piano? Well, hopefully I've kind of answered some of those things. I do want to take a moment to say, I often see across the board in a lot of the piano teaching forums, I see posts about pictures of students' hands looking like this. I don't know how clear my hand is. Yeah, my student's hand looks like this. What do I do? Well, it's not an easy answer. It's a complicated answer because anything that I've talked about to this point could be being done wrong and could be leading to that problem. And anything that I'm about to talk about from this point going forward could be leading to that problem. So it's not always just a simple fix. It's not always, I see a lot of people, well, the bench is too low or the bench is too close. And that might be, all right? But that's not all there is to it. And so that's why all this information is necessary, I feel, for teachers to have this information. And then next month we'll start talking about what do we do with this information. But right now I'm going to talk about sitting down at the piano. All right, so I'm gonna move my bench here for a second, and I want to sit and okay. Now I won't be able to hear you answer, but go ahead and give me a verbal answer, an audible answer, even though I won't hear it at home. All right? Am I sitting down? Yes or no? Now some of you might have said no because you obviously saw me sit, and so, it's a trick question, right? And you're absolutely right. I'm not sitting down. I'm sitting up, all right? It's a very important distinction to make. When we sit, we need to sit down, all right? Not up, all right? Our skeletal system will take care of the up. Our skeletal system goes up for the torso, all right? We don't have to make it go up, all right? Now, I'm sitting down. So we're going to talk about what goes into that. I'm going to move my bench back now. And we'll talk about what goes into sitting down at the piano. So in that first bit, there are a couple things that were wrong, all right? One was that I was sitting with well, now I'm trying to think of the right word. I'm thinking clenched, but that's not quite the word. Tightened, I guess. Flexed glutes, all right? My glutes are flexed here. And so as they're flexed, I'm kind of raised up into the air. Sheila calls this BL, butt levitation, all right? something we want to avoid, all right? So we relieve all tension, and that gets us down. Another idea that comes with oftentimes this idea of sitting straight, I'm going to fix this here, is, we think, all right, shoulders back, chest out, all right, and oftentimes students will see them sitting with their knees together, all right? Well, that right there, just try that at home. Whether you're in just a regular chair or on a bench, try that at home. Knees together, shoulders back, chest out. It's not a very comfortable position, all right? You can let it go, don't hold it, all right? So I'll address those things one at a time. If I throw my chest out, we already talked about with the shoulders why throwing the shoulders back is bad. That restricts our motion, all right? If I stick my chest out, all right, that creates an arch in the back. Now the back is very important. There's some muscles at the base of the back, referred to scientifically as the latissimus dorsi. And if you're a worker-outer, which I'm not, you might have heard them called the lats before, all right? And what the latissimus dorsi do is they start down here near the base of the spine, and they kind of fan out and up into the arms, all right? So if I pull my back in like this, I create a tension down here in these muscles, which then creates a tightness and a restriction in my arms, so that even if my shoulders are in place, my arm motion is incredibly restricted. And again, I find my breathing very restricted in that posture. The knees together. This is something that is problematic, all right? Again, it creates this tightness here in the thighs. It creates a tightness in the lower back. That lower back tightness then translates into the arm. And again, it's restrictive to my breathing. Again, try it at home and just sit there for a couple seconds and move your arm back and forth, then let it go, move your arm back and forth, and see what you can see there, okay? Something to be on the lookout with your students is the tendency of pushing their legs out, and I don't know how far under the piano you can see, not very far, but kind of pushing the legs out, that's kind of in the way, like so. They'll kind of sometimes push up against the layer, or if you've got an upright against the base there, all right? That creates a tremendous amount of tightness in the legs, which translates up into the glutes, which translates up into the lower back, which translates into the arms, all right? Can you see how all these little things engage? What the problem is it's engaging muscles that are needed for other functions or are not needed for the function of playing the piano, okay? So that's something to keep an eye out for. Also, in the summer, sometimes, especially if we ever get back to teaching in person, or if you have a full body view of your students as you're teaching them, which I would highly recommend, by the way, you can sometimes see their little toes curled in, which you can't see me doing it right now because I'm wearing shoes. But sometimes when they come in the summer, they have sandals on, and you can see that happening. And again, that's another indicator of extreme tightness in their legs, all right? So just having them I'll just straight up tell them, I'll say, relax your toes, all right? It's okay to let them know that they've got to let their legs go, all right? So then, if all of these muscular things come into play, and we don't want them to, then what are we reliant on to keep us upright at the piano? Because all of these things kick in. We have wonderful instincts as human. All of these things kick in to keep us from doing one thing. Now notice what I said there. They keep us from doing one thing. They keep us from falling off the bench. Our instincts kick in to keep us from falling off the bench. If we're seated too far back on the bench, we tighten in this and we tighten in our lower back because we don't want to fall off the bench. All right. So we have to be careful with that sort of thing, not allowing our students to tighten up because they want to fall off the bench. Instead, we teach them to balance on the bench using the skeletal system mainly. Now, I want it understood, when I say using the skeletal system, I'm not saying that muscles aren't involved in posture or in balance. They absolutely are. But generally speaking, once those muscles are developed, they're nothing that we have to consciously activate. Unfortunately, when we get these ideas of posture, chest out, all that stuff, we step into the realm of engaging muscles that don't really play a role in posture, that don't play a role in keeping us upright, other than the role that we assign to them, an unnecessary role, all right? So if instead we learn how to use the skeletal system to keep us upright and from falling off the bench and balanced, that serves us, in my experience, far better. So I'd like to talk about 6 points of balance at the piano. All right, 6 points of balance in the skeletal system that we use at the piano. All right, 2 feet, 2 sit bones, 2 hands. All right, 2, 4, 6. All right, we'll start at the feet. One of my favorite books, both as a child and even now as an adult, or series of books rather, is C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia. And it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't know how well any of you know the series, but it's in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where Aslan he's about to turn a giant who had been turned to stone by the White Witch. He's about to turn that giant back into a flesh giant and not a stone giant. And what he does is he breathes on his feet, and from his feet, this golden whatever radiates, and all of a sudden he's not human, he's flesh again. All right? And what Aslan says is, if you, this is not a direct quote because I forgot to write it down. But basically, if you set the feet right, the rest will follow. And that might be the actual quote. But if you set the feet right, the rest will follow. All right? And I love that. I remember reading that several years ago and thinking, hey, that's kind of relevant to technique. If you set the feet right, the rest will follow. All right? Your students' feet need to be solidly either on the floor or on some sort of platform, a stool, a pedal extender, something that allows for them to have their feet firmly on something. Otherwise, they sit back on the bench and they dangle their legs like this, and guess what? Tremendous tightness in the legs, tremendous tightness in the glutes, tremendous tightness in the lower back, restricted arm movement. All right? So, as far as what you can do for them, for my younger students, a pedal extender, and I don't have mine with me today, but a pedal extender is a great investment. The problem is, especially if they're in music that's using a pedal. If not, a footstool will do just fine for them at home, all right? But the problem is you've got to get the parents on board with buying a pedal extender, all right? And that can be hard to do. But a lot of littles don't need to be using the pedal just yet. But that's kind of what you're up against if you've got your little ones playing repertoire that uses the pedal. But anyways, but a footstool or some sort of platform on the floor will be remarkably useful for them. Carpet squares they could use, boards they could use, anything can be used. I don't recommend books because they tend to have a little wobble, even hardback books. Let's see. So that's pretty much all. I do have a pedal extender that I would recommend. If you'd like me to send you the link, I'd be happy to do that. Then, as far as how the feet should look, then you want to have, at least to start out, before they start pedaling, you want to have the knees above the ankles, all right, and the knees about a shoulder width apart, all right. So you have this kind of centrism, all right, and from that, this is the thing to understand about balance. When we're walking, we balance. right? We're moving from balance point to balance point. We're shifting balance point. So a starting point for balance is not a final point for balance. We're able to move out from these points of balance. So when it comes to them needing to move out to pedal, they simply move out. They're still able to balance there, all right? But if they aren't pedaling, they're going to be most secure here. But they're still able to balance on the piano. But if their feet are stuck out like this, way out in front, especially on a grand, on an upright there's some restriction as to how far they can go, then again, they start to get this kind of laxness in here, which creates a bit of a slump. I don't know if you can see the slump in the back. I think you could. I could feel that one, all right? All right, and we don't want that slump in the back because, again, that puts pressure on the spine, which puts pressure on the muscles that tie into the spine, which tightens up the arms, okay? I'm sure you all are spotting a theme. I hope I'm not beating a dead horse too much. Let's see, then after the feet, those are our first 2 points of balance, we have the sit bones, all right? And they are exactly what they sound like. They're the bones in our bottom that we sit on, all right? Sometimes they're nicknamed rocker bones because they're shaped kind of like that, the rocker part of of one of those old-fashioned rocking chairs, all right? Now what we want is we want to be seated on about the front 2/3 to half of the bench, all right? Or half to 2/3, I suppose, of the bench, all right? This allows us to balance forward into our feet, to throw our lower body weight into balancing into our feet, all right? Which makes pedaling easier because that weight is going down rather than being thrown up here again into my upper legs and lower back, and pedaling is just next to impossible there, all right? This allows for easier motion from side to side on the piano for leaps and such, all right? And so we have to know then where to sit because these bones have a tremendous range. It allows for us to do this, all right? So I don't want to sit on the back of my sit bones because if I sit on the back of my sit bones, guess what? Pulls in that lower back, all right? Creates that slump, creates that tightness, and guess what? Arms are restricted, all right? So I want to sit towards the front of my sit bones. And I don't know, I just did it kind of involuntarily. What I do is I make just a soft fist and I stick it on the bench and I swing my pelvis out, and that usually refreshes me to the front of my sit bones. So that's something you can try at home if you're on a bench, or you can try later, is lift yourself up, swing your pelvis out slightly. You don't want to swing it way out, just a little bit. And that should put you on your sit bones, all right? Towards the front of the bench. And again, that keeps the pressure off your spine, off those lower back muscles, and it stops you from affecting that upper body posture, caving in the chest and such. You also have to be careful of rolling forward on the sit bones, all right? So there's a difference between swinging them under and having this and rolling forward on them and creating this arch in your back, okay? Apart from the tightness in that, what it does is it throws your upper body weight backwards. And this is counterproductive to what we're trying to do, seeing as the keys are forward. The keys are in front of us. So now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we want to aim ourselves forward. We just don't want to aim ourselves backward away from it either, all right? We have enough that we're up against. We don't want to add to that. Let's see. One other little thing before we talk about the hands, or before I take questions, and then we'll finish up by talking about the hands. You want your shoulders to be positioned over your hips. Now your hips are here, all right? They aren't here. They aren't here. They're here in the center of your body. So you want your shoulders in the center of your body. Again, not thrown back, not thrown forward, just shoulders over hips, all right? And that allows for you to maintain this upright. Before I take a question, I do want to throw in an idea from Alexander, from the Alexander technique. I do want to say I've studied Alexander technique, I've taken lessons. I am not a certified Alexander instructor. I've not nearly as much experience with it as I have with Taubman technique, but I have enough to get me through. And one of the big ideas of Alexander technique is thought. Okay, your brain tells your body to do something, and it does it. Okay, so my brain tells my torso to stay upright, and my torso stays upright. I don't make myself stay upright. My brain says, keep going up. So in Alexander technique, they refer to it as lengthening and widening. Your back is constantly going up and down and constantly going side to side. So you have this tremendous height, well, as much height as you have, and this tremendous expanse from side to side without closing down or caving in. All right? Do we have any questions to this point? No questions? Well, that's either a really good sign or a really bad sign.
I think you're being very clear, so that's a good thing.
Okay, good. Good. All right, so one more thing to talk about today, and this will set us up for next month's session, in which I will talk about rotation. All right? And that's kind of going to be our jumping off point of technique. But all of this stuff is necessary. Again, like I said a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, it doesn't do us any good to adjust the wrong thing when we see our students doing something. We have to be aware of all the things that they could be doing wrong and learn how to pinpoint that in them, all right? And help recognize what it is. And the more you do of it, the easier, like anything else, the more you do of it, the better you get at it. I won't say the easier it becomes, the better you get at it, okay? So now we're going to talk about the hands as balance points, all right? We're going to talk about it in a couple terms. We're going to talk about height at the piano, which is not a new concept. We're going to talk about distance at the piano. Again, not probably a new concept to most of us, okay? Now this is where this knowledge of the ulna being the weight-bearing bone of the forearm comes in very handy, because we want to use that as our measuring factor of where we sit in relation to the piano. All right? So ideally, we want to be set up so that our ulna is level with the top of our keys. The bottom of our ulna, as we can tell, the bottom of our arm here, is level with the top of the keys. All right? Notice I have a tilt in my hand. I'm not doing this. All right? I'm doing this. My ulna is level approximately. Yes. All right. I had it set before, so I want to make sure. I think I'm a little further back, and I'll fix that in a minute. But it's level with the top of the keys. Now, our students often have the problem of being too low at the piano. All right? The nice thing about the height of benches is they can be changed. Now, students oftentimes do not have an artist bench, all right? Sometimes teachers don't have an artist bench, and that's okay. That's okay. I'm very fortunate to have this bench accessible to me, all right? But the height of this bench can be changed going up and down. A lot of standard artist benches where the mechanism, this one, I don't know how clearly you can see it, not very clearly, the mechanism isn't covered in this one. So this one goes higher than a standard artist bench will, but a lot of times, even a standard artist bench, not only for children, but for shorter adults, it doesn't get high enough. So let me recommend, and I didn't, I'll step out of frame for a moment, bring this back into frame. Let me recommend a bench like this. Now, this is not actually the bench I recommend, but it's similar to this. I have the brand at home. Again, I can send it to anyone who's interested. But a bench like this that has multiple heights, but you want to be careful with these benches. This bench here has a very squishy top, which I don't recommend. I'm not saying don't have a soft top, a top that has some give, but don't have a very squishy one, because that's going to alter the height eventually, all right? Which again, you don't really want. But something similar to this with a firmer top is a great option because it gets higher than a lot of standard artist benches. And it works well for, like I say, children, yes, but even shorter adults, it works very well for. One of my undergraduate professors, Vicki Conway, is I don't know her exact height, but very, very short. Well, I guess that's all relative, but quite short, let me say that. And this is what she played with for a long time before she got a hydraulic bench that had a good height to it. And I think she still gigs with it because it's easy to carry around. It's relatively inexpensive. Last time I looked, under $100 still. And it's really a great tool. You'll never regret having one for your studio, and your students can certainly afford them, generally speaking. So that would be what I would recommend. Now, sometimes, I don't have an example right here, but sometimes our students just have those good old-fashioned wooden benches that just don't go up or down, and mom and dad don't have money to get something like this. Even I get it. Budgets are a thing. You know, we have to be compassionate and understanding. Or they're not willing sometimes. Okay? I recommend, when you have those benches, that you not stick things on the benches. And again, like I said with the feet, certainly not books, because books have that give, which can give that insecurity. And insecurity is always going to lead to tightness in musculature to keep them from falling off the bench. So we don't want that. But whenever possible, support the bench from underneath. So if they can put carpet squares on the bench, they can put them under the bench. All right? A friend of mine, Lynn Rice C., she was on faculty at Sheila's seminar for however many years the seminar ran. And her husband used to make these blocks that had coaster type things on them, and they'd stick them under the legs of benches, and those worked tremendously for height changing, and they looked very nice. But you can use, at home, these kids could use pieces of wood, planks of wood that, they could stretch, get one long enough to go between the legs or whatever. And oftentimes it doesn't need to be a dramatic difference. It just needs to be at most a couple inches, but usually not even that much, okay? So that's just some thought about that. If it has to be something on the bench, I recommend one of those good, again, firm gardening pads. All right, you don't want to use something too cushiony because, again, that's going to create, they're going to feel wobbly, and they're going to start to tighten up and start to feel like they're going to fall off, and that's not a good thing. All right, so that deals with height, and then we want to check distance, all right? And again, we're going to use the ulna to measure. So a lot of teachers, and even I think even probably some books, tell the students, make a soft fist and check your distance like this, okay? Now my problem with that is that my weight-bearing bone is stuck up in the air, so is my arm weight. So I'm not really getting an accurate measurement of how far my arm weight is from the keys, because I'm measuring more towards my radius than I am towards my ulna. So what I recommend is doing it like this, all right? And as you can see, I'm having to lean forward, and you don't want straight arms, by the way, like this, all right? You want just a gentle curve, all right, in the arm. Not a 90-degree angle, not completely straight, just a gentle curve to the arm. So, and you want to be able to achieve that without leaning forward or pushing back. So, I'm going to scoot my bench up just a little bit, and that's much better. That's much better. All right? Sometimes you'll see students do this. When I taught in someone else's studio for years, she was always big on having students check their distance at the recital, which is great, except all of her students would do this. Little Susan would play, and then big old Brian would come up to the piano, and he'd do this, but he'd do this. He'd say, okay, my arms look good, and then do this, and then lean forward. All right? The point of doing this is knowing whether you need to move the bench or not. So if you're going to teach your students to do that, teach them that they also need to be able to do it maintaining an upright poise. That's the word, by the way, I like to use instead of posture, poise. Poise gives the sense of I'm ready to go where I need to go from a point of balance and remain in balance without falling off the bench. But anyways, they're in an upright poise, all right? They're thinking up, and they've got this gentle curve. They aren't pushing back, they aren't leaning forward, and then that's good, all right? Let's see. I think that that's pretty much it. So basically, just to kind of not go too much into it, but a little bit of a preview towards next month, a little sneak peek. We're gonna then take all this information, now that we're at the piano, and how do we get our arm weight into the piano? What's the most efficient way, and how do we teach it to our students? All right. So at this point, I'll open up. If there are any questions, I'm going to switch my camera. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer, or points of discussion, I'm happy to answer. And yeah, anybody?
Hey, I have one for you, Seth. I think a lot of them, actually, I'm going to save because I think they're more about application, which you're going to, start getting into next time. But my first, one I had right away is, I don't know if you can see this. This is one of those little balls that you put your thumb and your fingers here. And the idea of this was stretching okay, can you see it?
Uh-huh.
So, and I got this when my wrist was sore from, I think, more guitar than piano, but his idea was that you exercise these a lot, the grips, but not the opposite way when you go out, and that gets more of the back. And now, hearing you talk about the small versus the bigger, I'm wondering if the exercise, they're kind of different ones, but it's mainly just kind of squeezing and opening, and there are different grip sizes. And I'm wondering, does this seem to you helpful, negative, or neutral as far as using the as far as piano?
Anything, all things in moderation. I would say neutral to negative would be the sign. At best, neutral if you're not overdoing it. If you are, or you're doing too much of it, I would say negative. And a lot of these ideas, by the way, they can. I don't have the expertise in other instruments, but they can be carried over. These are body. So if then we can take it and you can apply it, to playing guitar or whatever as well, And I think a lot of problems come in. People don't realize how much, even with these little guys, how much gripping we do, how much pointing out and pulling. Sorry, I'm trying to get myself in frame here. Pulling down from our thumbs, or doing this sort of thing or this sort of thing. All right. How much of that we really do, and how detrimental it can be. So just being careful of that sort of usage. Sometimes we don't have any choice but to engage here.
Yeah. I think the point where this was more we already engage here a lot, but we don't engage the opposite, the extensor version versus the flexion. And so it's trying to balance out the two, whereas we grip a lot, but
I don't want to get too off topic here, but I always thought doing this was a good stretch for your upper arms. That's talking about just general exercise without overdoing it.
Yeah.
Right. So again, I know some people who would be vehemently against that, and I try not to be vehemently against most things unless you're out there murdering people. But I would say, especially, and I think you just said it, generally speaking, but specific to piano, there wouldn't really be a whole lot of point, because I don't need to.
Not for piano.
To use this range of motion.
Yeah, that's my question, because we're not using those big ones, we're using the medium ones, right?
It's different.
Yeah,
okay. Using things for piano versus just general wellness, we might be doing other things with our hands.
Right. So doing this, I can do this for a couple minutes, or once or twice a day for the rest of my life probably, and not see any negative effects. I don't know that I would, but you get into the idea of, say you're doing push-ups or something. That's something where you got to be really careful, because you're taking and putting all the strain of your body, especially body weight, on that little carpal tunnel. You got to be careful with stuff like that. But there are also ways of doing it like I said, I'm not really a worker outer, but I've seen people, see, my camera's mirrored, so I'm moving the wrong way. But, you know, I've seen people make a fist and do push-ups from that, maintain this without doing that, or use dumbbells or something like that, to where they aren't pushing down and using the hand like that. But again, you know, I think it comes down to the amount of use. If you overuse anything, it's what, like what I said, maximum effort comes from, or at least, sorry, least amount of effort to produce the maximum result. So if you find as much as you need of something and no more than that, you'll be just fine, generally speaking, I think.
Yeah, I think you did a great job with your presentation, keeping the anatomical knowledge within the realm of the expertise of piano, because it's so easy that stretches out into another subject, but you know, just keeping it in the realm of that. The other thing I really liked was like the 6 points of balance, because that makes it really clear that you just kind of keep that focus. Right. And then there's like a whole bunch of little things you're going to do here and there with the kids to get them straight.
But those 6 things are things that they can easily check for themselves.
Yeah, I never even thought of sit bones.
Yeah. It's funny because my very first piano lesson, so I have kind of well, I don't know if it's a unique story or not, but a different story, I suppose. I taught myself piano for 4 years, and I was actually reading out of a hymnal and playing organ, not well, but, you know, and I wasn't using the pedal board or anything at the small church that I went to back in Michigan. And my very first lesson with my very first piano teacher, she talked about the sit bones. Now, I don't remember what she said. I just remember being an immature 11-year-old and thinking, haha, my teacher just talked about butts. You know, but I do remember that. I don't remember what she said in regards to it, though. But yeah, so yeah, the feet, the sit bones, the hands, those are things that the kids can, you know, and I've had to become okay with constantly repeating, and I'm sure we all know this, but constantly repeating myself to kids. This is a lot. Even those 3 things, you know, feet, sit bones, hands. That's a lot for them to keep in mind, you know. And then once we start adding rotation and stuff, and we'll get into what all they really need to know and what they really don't need to know as time goes on. But yeah. So I'm glad that that's a good takeaway for you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I like the approach that it's based on the physicality of us. And I think traditionally this kind of stuff is taught through behavior, like sit up, sit straight, do all that. It's all about behavior based and making it more physicality based. You have lots more wiggle room to be telling kids a bunch of stuff according to their needs, but you're still staying with those core principles within it.
Exactly. And it's sometimes our vocabulary just doesn't yet hold the words that we need it to. And I think sometimes a lot of teachers, when they hear this for the first time, you know, I know for myself, when I heard all this information for the first time, I was like, oh, okay, so that's what I should be saying instead of sit up. Because obviously, I don't think a lot of us, when we tell our students to sit up, want them to do, you know, this, you know, but what does, you know, that to them is what sitting up is. And of course, you know, if you get the smart aleck kids, you have the ones who, you know, do that sort of thing just to, you know, be a little bit sassy, you know. And so if you're able to put in specifically, this is what I need you to do, that kind of cuts them off from that and keeps them from hopefully experiencing injury. Of course, probably a lot of our students don't practice enough to experience injury, but at the same time, it can happen anywhere to anyone, and we never know what our students might, you know, when that inspiration might strike our students. So if we get them that good foundation from the beginning, you know, then if that inspiration strikes them and all of a sudden they decide they step up their practicing game and they are playing big repertoire, then we're able to really help them with that. So, yeah. Well, good. So I haven't yet set a date. It'll probably, this is the third Saturday. I'll probably try to do it consistently like that, third Saturday of the month. So it'll probably be whatever the third Saturday of August is. I'll set up another one to talk about forearm rotation and balancing the keys, or balancing the keys and forearm rotation. It's going to be in that order. So again, I'm keeping this first round of these workshops free because I just kind of want to get people interested and see what's what. So if you're available, the only thing that you're spending is your time. So if it's worth it to you, then I'm happy to spend that time with you all.
Very
Thank
worth
you,
it.
Seth.
Thank you.
Appreciate
it so
very
much.
It was awesome.
Absolutely. Not a problem. I'm going to